Hello, my fellow people of the plant. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast, your favorite podcast that includes industry facing conversations with the industry's leading experts that aim to educate and inform the public regarding the plant's endless benefits. My guest today is Melissa Ann Vitale. She's the owner and founder of MAV PR. Hello, Melissa. How are you?
Hey, Kevin, how's it going?
It's going great. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm so glad that we got to make this happen. I want to give a quick shout out to the lovely women of Her Highness, Laura and Allison, for making this intro. They sung your praises. They had high praises for you, and I've met you prior, so it's great to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me. Love the starting off with strong with the client mention. Love Her Highness. Practically begged them to be my client because I was so addicted to everything they make, from their pleasure oil to their ring, which I have on, always wear it. Never any surprises who the cloud of cannabis smoke is coming from. Wearing it right on my ring. And they're wonderful. They're my absolute darlings. And, you know, very happy to be a part of one of the fastest women growing cannabis brands and in the country and soon to be world.
Absolutely, yeah, and they're just great women overall too. And I want to get into, you mentioned some of the products, and and your focus, is sex positive and sex cannabis, or excuse me, cannabis as well. So let's talk about. I know that you're in Rome right now. You've been traveling in Rome and in France. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing out there with your clients, and then we'll kind of get back into your background and how you got to where you are today.
Perfect. So I'm a born and bred East Coaster, now live in New York. And in order to love and live in New York, you have to get out of the city as often as you can. And I had tough life, had to come to Europe this summer for work. My clients, they are a luxury swingers getaway destination service. So they do takeovers of resorts. They host private cruises. And so we started a couple of weeks ago in south of France in a town called Cap d'Agde. And it is a naturist village that attracts around 3,000 swingers every summer. And so they do this big takeover where they just, get us into all the good parties. We go as a group. We have theme nights. It's like luxury adult summer camp because you make such great friends and such wonderful connections, and it's so fun. And after we were in Cap, we went up to Paris, where we took off from Paris, and we went down the Seine in a luxury riverboat, all the way from Normandy and back. And we stopped, everywhere from Monet's Giverny Gardens, places where Napoleon and Josephine, one of their houses, where Joan of Arc was burned, where Van Gogh was buried, beaches of Normandy. There was a playroom on the boat. So after all these really cultural and historic achievements, which by the way, you can't take swingers anywhere. So we were in Monet's house, and we were just making such dirty jokes, and we're like, okay, you really can't take us anywhere. We were even on the beaches of Normandy crying together, and then everyone was having sex with each other later that night. Totally fun. Trying to keep up with 60 plus swinger couples for 16 days straight is very tiring and exhausting work, but someone's got to do it.
I bet.
And now I'm resuming my normal travel in Europe, where I just see some friends and take a little vacation for myself. First one since I started my business. So, and of course, no trip in Europe is complete without a visit to Amsterdam, at least when you work in the cannabis industry. So I'll get there in a couple weeks as well.
That's so interesting. And I want to talk, about like your work specifically. And I butchered kind of what you do and your title earlier. So you're sex positive, cannabis positive, queer woman who is a owner and founder of a PR agency. So when you talk about your clients and what you're doing out in Europe, really it's just kind of supporting their communication efforts and really promotion, I would imagine, things like that. Just kind of typical PR responsibilities and duties like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, usually I come to Europe because in August it gets really quiet in New York City. Everyone's on vacation. If they're not on vacation, they're taking over for someone who's on vacation. So meetings just don't hit the ground in August. But I do see a bunch of folks in the media and networking when I come to Europe instead. And so I only work with sex or cannabis clients. I will make an exception for a psychedelic brand or something that is like psychedelic adjacent. So we just
Right.
brought on a wonderful client with a very hunky CEO who, is a good friend of mine, and they do mushroom lattes. And so it's not psychedelic, every consumer can have it, but because he's also a vet of Burning Man and everything, I'm like, okay, and at the play scene, we know each other through the play scene. It's very much, I'm like, this is very aligned with us. It's a beautiful brand. So we will make an exception for something mushroom adjacent, but that's
Sure.
about the only exceptions we make.
Right. No, that makes sense. There's kind of a tie there in a way, right? I mean, when it comes to alternative remedies and different kind of therapeutics, especially what psilocybin offers for mental health and just relaxation and just a different perspective overall. So that's really cool. And so I want to let's talk about sex and cannabis, right? I mean, that's really you're focused on that from a journalist and a PR perspective, like you mentioned, as well as sex clients. So these two vices, right? Tell us how they blend and why you're so fascinated with it.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I was always that kid who my Barbies had orgies and definitely smoked grass, but I was raised mostly by a former hippie who worked for Columbia Records in the 70s. So, we've always had a very kind of just drug neutral household where it was, these aren't bad, but they can be dangerous. So, just don't get addicted and have fun. Make sure you trust where they're coming from. It was
Right.
always really positive conversation around it. And on the surface, they're both very sensational. On the sex side, you can, the biggest orgasm, squirting, big, buzzwords around sex, porn, and same thing with cannabis and even the psychedelics industry, getting high, getting higher, the biggest high you can. But really, these have really tangible effects on people's mental well-being. And specifically, where I stand with press is, I'm basically a mouthpiece for not just these industries, but a lot of the ideals that come out of these industries and social norms that we're trying to change and destigmatize. And they're both have, you know, if you identify as, positive in cannabis or sex, sometimes it can be really isolating. And so my job is not just get the vibrator featured in Rolling Stone or Forbes or Allure, and get a cannabis client in Money Magazine or Benzinga, but really create stories that consumers can feel seen and also find access to either the information or the resources or the products that could lead them on a way to really changing their lives.
Hmm. That's so interesting and so important and so challenging, I bet too, from your perspective, right? Because you have two highly stigmatized, highly, polarized like two issues that people are just afraid to talk about and afraid to be, I guess, open about, right? Because I guess when you talk about the play community and whatnot, I'm sure it's pretty big once you find out who it is and you're open at that point. But when you're closed, you kind of feel alone, to your point, and it can be a lonely feeling. So how do you get through those challenges of like overcoming the stigma and then bringing these stories to life to really showcase who these people are and what they're passionate about?
Great question. Absolutely. We tap dance on sensationalism quite a bit. We never want to cross that line where it's, something that the Sun is going to write about. Not that I don't love the Sun or some of the more splashy UK tabloids, but I don't really call it a win if, someone's sex life is branded on the front page. That doesn't really create a story that people can relate to or align with. But so we do a lot of education around these things. And even if we do something a little splashy, in a pitch, as soon as it gets accepted, we call up the journalist and say, hey, okay, I just want to make sure you understand the story we're trying to tell. It's not this, it's not this. What's your angle? No, 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 no. Got to redirect you this way. Like this is, and telling, these stories that come from both sex and cannabis, they're so fascinating and they really are life changing, right? When someone, I saw it a lot in the past few weeks where I saw folks who come from most, like the swinger community is mostly, there's a lot of bisexual women, but you're not finding a lot of pansexual people who fall outside of straight, bi, or curious. Um, and you can see some folks who if they had that role model, they might be a little more, they might call themselves heteroflexible or bi-curious or pansexual or queer, but they're not because they don't really see that, that these things are not just obtainable, but really rewarding to those who get to live as their true selves. And same thing with, cannabis, whether if you have a stigma against it or not, talk to a mother whose child was basically an incubator baby, one of those test tube kids who always had IVs because the one pill that they had gave them side effects. So they had to have other pills and all this, and it's changed by one CBD or even a THC gummy. If they're in a state where it's legal for this type of, you know, treatment. And so it really changes people's lives. And so getting to tell those stories, it's very easy to be really splashy, but the stories beneath the surface are often even more exciting than just sex, cannabis, drugs.
Which most people probably think, like you said, from the offset, that you have to like really steer them in the direction of no, this is the story we're trying to tell. I totally get that. So what's one like or two like stories that really that come to mind to you that are worth telling or worth noting?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorites where we really kind of had to not just give a better story, but because that's what the journalist was looking for. They didn't want that on the surface. One of my long-term babes, Michael Stahl, he shouted me out in a podcast recently, so I feel great that I get to return the favor. But he called me in response to one of my team's pitches, and it's like, "Oh, this looks great, but I just did some research. It looks like a friend of mine already profiled the brand, the play parties and everything." And I kind of said, I was like, well, hold on. They didn't say anything about the Jehovah's Witness thing. He's like, what do you mean Jehovah's Witness thing? And I'm like, well, the founder of this community is a former Jehovah's Witness. So those people who knocked on your door and said, are you aware that the earthquakes are happening because of God's wrath on us? That was Daniel Saint of NSFW when he was growing up. He's had mop water thrown on him. He's had doors slammed in his face, and he broke away from the Jehovah's Witness community, and it's really shaped how he builds a community that, we didn't even realize it until one time we asked all of the new members to kind of open up why they were here. And every single one of them was repressed sexually at some point, whether it was because of religion or society based on the Puritan religion, whatever the case was, everyone was repressed in the same way. And Daniel creating that space from the place that he came from as a Jehovah's Witness really just created a lot more genuine community than people who were just there to fuck and fuck their friends,
Right. He
which
actually
they were there to do too.
of course, right. But I mean, again, it goes back to community, right? And like the reason why this activity or the plant or whatever brings people together, right? And
For
and
sure.
and building like meaningful relationships, like you said. I mean, you're in Rome right now, and you mentioned with your clients, like these are people that you'll be friends with, forever. So that's really cool. That's awesome. And that's really how humans are built, right? No matter what type of community it is, we just seem to gravitate to that interest, and then like-minded people get together and build communities and share ideas and build relationships off of it. It's kind of the natural course of life. So
And you see it so much in the cannabis industry because
yeah,
especially since we are so stigmatized outside of it, we're like, oh, people who don't judge us, people who are not going to give us a dirty look for lighting up a joint, they're going to, unless we don't share, right? So it's so nice to be especially in both sex and cannabis, are really stigmatized, that when you don't have to explain yourself, defend yourself, or even just excuse yourself from being who you are, it's so wonderful. And that's why I've noticed that both the sex and cannabis industries and folks in media who I've talked to who transitioned from either fashion or beauty or health or tech, they're like, oh, I love working in cannabis. I think you even said this too. Everyone's so nice.
Everyone's so nice. There's no judgment. And like, if you've consumed over the years, I was going to say this earlier, like when you mentioned that sense of loneliness for some people that haven't been open about what they're interested in or who they are and so on, it's like cannabis also helps in a way, like if you do it over time, about not caring what other people think, really. You know, you're so at peace and comfort with who you are, that all that stuff kind of doesn't even matter at some point, you know. I mean, I know it's a struggle for more than others, but I think that that's another great benefit of cannabinoid therapeutics, you know.
Oh, for sure. I definitely don't react as angrily as I did in my youth because I'm just constantly high, just constantly. My mood is always managed.
Right, exactly. And so, you know, and going back to another reason why it seems like, and from your perspective, and I have seen it, that sex and cannabis are a great pair, is from some of the studies and data that we've seen. So here's first a quote that I'll read, and then I'm going to share my screen for those being able to watch so they can see these data points. But this quote says, marijuana or cannabis can dramatically lower stress and thereby possibly open doors to greater sexual enjoyment and longer time spent masturbating to enjoy sexual stimulation. So the fact that it lowers your stress, it allows your body to be in a place where you can, you know, get enhanced pleasure or orgasm. So is that, like, you know, your experience, Melissa, and kind of tell us, you know, what your thoughts are on that.
Absolutely. So we saw this a lot in the pandemic. And I'm just getting a notification that my internet connection is unstable. So just let me know if you can't hear me or see me. I'm sure it's gonna, sometimes we have these like little brown spots
You're
late night.
good.
So
No problem.
okay,
Yeah.
great. But so we saw this a lot in the pandemic, that people were not wanting to be intimate, whether it was with themselves or with partners, because they had a difficult time separating all the stress. You cannot experience desire if you are focused on something else, or if you do, it's going to be a very shallow version of the desire. So, really, you need to be able to have that moment in between when your workday ends, when you're worrying about something, when your to do list ends, to where you transition into that mindset where you're without desire. A great resource about this is tickle.life. They have it's a big online platform of all revered sex positive articles, podcasts, education courses, content, just so much content. And they just did a back to, Beyond the Basic series called Light Your Fire. And they really talked about how desire needs to be, you know, will dwindle if you're focusing on other things. And if you think about it, you know, everyone thinks it's so romantic, you know, honey, out home from work, your partner just jumps on you and immediately you fall into bed, and like, you know, like in I Love Lucy or something. And that's not always the case,
Right.
because your partner comes home and they're like, oh my God, I just like stopped thinking about work. I need like a joint, a drink. You know, if you want to get naked on the bed and masturbate, I will absolutely watch you and enjoy it. And then I'll be able to play. But, you know, we need to be able to have that transition for desire. Cannabis is so great because, and I wish there were more studies on this. I really think that there's a connection between the pleasure and cannabis sensor is in the brain, but they all produce really good feelings like oxytocin and everything. So
Sure.
it's got to be something as well. But there is such a connection that when you share a joint with someone, A, it really cuts down on what you're thinking, quiets your mind so that you can just focus on your partner at hand. I know so many people who use cannabis as foreplay. I myself, if I'm working an event, I'm often working these playful events, and I have a very hard stop for when press need to either finish up reporting or finish up reporting and take your pants off. It's, you're either staying to play or you're leaving because you're done reporting, but no reporting happens after, like, whether it's 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, whenever I want to start getting playful. And I tell my partners about 30 minutes after so that I have time to kind of unwind, smoke a bunch of joints outside of that workspace, create that play space, because you need to have that transition time. And so many times people will not take that transition time, get frustrated that they're not getting turned on, but really you just need to be able to. Another great resource is Kenneth Play. He, during the pandemic, his partner, his fiance, is a ER doctor. And so she had a lot of time transitioning from the, I believe it's parasympathetic and sympathetic response phase when, and again, Kenneth can quote this way better than me. So anything towards desire, you need that transition period.
Wow, that's so interesting. And one thing that comes to mind when I hear you talk is, and it sounds basic, but it's related to any industry, and that's like or having a full-time job, is work-life balance, right? And what's interesting about what you do in the quote unquote like the vice industry, right? I saw that on your website. Why don't you explain that? But let me just finish my thought before. So, like, it's funny how your day-to-day life and interests in a certain vice blend into your work. So, like you said, when you're at a conference and it's play friendly, and you're in that mode of operation, it's like you got to say, hey, time out, no more work talk. We're now in the play mindset. We need to focus on each other.
Absolutely. It is difficult to create those boundaries. The pandemic has been really good with helping me create those boundaries because you're right, my work does blend so much. When I started my agency, I really hoped that I could have one of, like, what I call my passion clients, either an adult or a cannabis brand, preferably one of each, preferably one that blended the two. And now I only work in those intervals. So it's, absolutely a dream come true that I get to be the mouthpiece. I'm a great publicist and I'm a great speaker and have a big mouth, and I'm so glad that I get to use it for things that I'm really passionate about. I consider it vice, but I also call it alternative wellness, depending on the space I'm in. I'm not a big fan of considering some of these really intrinsic parts of people's lives of vice. However, that's also the lens that we're categorized into the law, that we're categorized in some media platforms as well. So it's a nice clandestine way to say sex and cannabis without having to say it. People tend to understand vices, and it also, creates a question of what are these vices? And, it's my favorite thing is when someone says to me, especially someone who doesn't work in the industry, so, these aren't vices, they're wellness. And I'm like, I'm doing my job right. We're going in that direction because that's the goal. Honestly, I was so distracted by the light. I don't even remember if I answered your question or
No,
not.
you did. And it's funny that you say that, because that seems to be the trend in a lot of different like industries that are emerging right now. So cannabis being one, right? You have the progressive movement overall also, right? Inclusion of diversity. And then you also have the emergence of psychedelics, right? And so it just seems like people are really looking toward different alternatives and ways of thinking than what we've been kind of conditioned or trained to be thinking and doing in the past.
Again, the pandemic really opened up so many ulterior veins of thinking where we're thinking about, it's not just hustle, 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 capitalism, make money, rest when you die, but that we're here on this world to live, not to work. And goes back to your question about that work-life balance. I think we're all having that. And pleasure and cannabis have really risen, especially when people weren't allowed to travel or go to restaurants or see friends or all the other ways that they might be able to break up their life between work, live, and have fun. Cannabis and sex became an essential. People became a lot more interested in ketamine therapies. People really, the modern thought is just because it's existed for so long doesn't mean we have to accept it, right? Just because systematic racism has existed for so long doesn't mean we have to accept it. Just because pay inequality has existed for so long doesn't mean we have to accept it. Just because big pharma and how they're just ravaging consumers, on a just to be able to live, doesn't need to be accepted. And sex and cannabis, and even it goes into Me Too as well. Just because women have always been assaulted, have always been, faced microaggressions from men or in the workplace or whatever, you want to summarize, doesn't mean it needs to be accepted. And so sex and cannabis, even again, though they're very sensational, those are that really deep running themes throughout them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I totally am with you on the wellness aspect of this, the way things are headed, because people are looking to get well the way that their body and their background and everything that makes them kind of what will give them wellness, right? And it's outside of what you said, kind of like what big pharma has been trained us to do by prescribing so many medications for different medications and so on. Not to say that they're all bad, but there is this sense of overuse and using to manage as opposed to getting better, right? Or improving the way of life. So you mentioned that you're a consumer every day. So I mean, like, cannabis is wellness in your eyes as it is mine, right? So how do you consume mostly? Is it flower? Is it pen?
So you see me with my pens. I only have pens when I'm in Europe, just because it's, I won't smoke inside an Airbnb the way I would in my own office.
Right.
But I'm normally a flower gal. I love my indica dominant, slightly spliffed joint. So there's just a little bit of tobacco in there to clear the mind. Probably not what my doctor wants me to say. And I use cannabis not just to treat, pain, or, I think it's so silly when you have, a pain somewhere, you take, or especially like a headache or whatever. Typically it's from lack of water, lack of, you're having caffeine withdrawals, whatever the case is. Taking Advil covers and masks the symptom, but it doesn't actually treat what your body needs. Whereas, and same thing with all the pills you take instead of cannabis. Cannabis will treat, or at least aid, reduce the symptoms of whatever you're trying to treat, but without having all those, with a pill, you have the active ingredients, and then you have tons of inactive ingredients. And whether all those ingredients have been tested about going through the liver, that's where long-term use tends to be problematic. Where cannabis, at some point I would like to be able to transition to edibles and non-smokables once New York's recreational system is a little more mature.
Right. And that's exciting, by the way. I forgot. I mean, I know you're in New York, right? You're based in New York. And so that's coming up. That's exciting.
I'm from New Jersey. So both my states that I have called home in my life became legal in the last year. So it's been hugely exciting. The day my dad and I can have a father-daughter date to New Jersey dispensary is going to be like such a highlight for us. Definitely going to take some selfies with my dad.
Yes.
And then, in New York, it's also it's a little jarring because I forget that it's not legal in the rest of the world, because really all I go to places like California, Colorado, New York, New Jersey. All these states are now legal. You can have a joint while talking with a police officer. And I forgot about that when I was in France. So
Oopsie. Yeah. Well, at least you're not you weren't apprehended because you're talking to us today. So that's
I
a
was
good thing.
almost. It's a good thing I'm a good talker.
Do you know French, or did you how did you get out of that one?
Well, I started off by trying just to say, oh, it's tobacco in French. And then they started screaming at me in French. And I just immediately dropped the I'm a dumb American card. Do not yell at me right now.
That's good call. It's plan B, right? Exactly. Yeah, just play dumb. Wait, what?
Yeah.
I didn't know I could do this.
I was like,
Yeah.
oh, it's CBD.
the go-to at CBD. Yeah, exactly.
It's never CBD.
Yeah, who carries a huge jar around of flower CBD? You know, there's some, I guess. I don't know.
There are people who really do love it, and more power to them. It's just I'm a THC or else kind of gal.
Sure. No. And I don't discriminate on the cannabinoids either. I use CBD in like more topicals for like, rubs after a run, or if I play golf, I'm doing CBD tinctures. But on the psychoactive front, I'm with you. I need the THC for sure. Um, so hey, as we wrap up, tell us, Melissa, like, what are your focus areas for 2021 and beyond, running your PR agency, MAV PR, and give us some, maybe like pull out your crystal ball predictions for the industry in the coming months, years, whatever, as we're continuing to progress in this industry.
Absolutely. So I'm really looking forward to, and I'm hoping we're going to see more cross between cannabis and hospitality activations. And I would love if we're seeing even more of the blending of devices, whether it's bringing in psychedelics into that conversation or to that space as well. Same thing with sex. We're starting to see an uptick of more luxury offerings for hospitality in both sex and cannabis. And I would love it for, the queer, kinky cannabis smokers like me, that we can kind of have something that accepts both of them, where we can not only bring our partners, however many there are, all dressed up in our fetish gear, with our joints all rolled, our blunts, whatever, most of my partners, we all carry around like weed with us everywhere we go. And so great when you go with them, because someone's always got cannabis on them. It's always a party, even if we're like standing on the corner waiting to get in. And not that often happens when, once you've been in the scene for quite some time.
Right.
But we'll hang out to finish our joint. And so I'm hoping to see more spaces that blend the two. I'm already starting to see more mainstream spaces that are utilizing sex positivity as like entertainment. And we're seeing a huge, especially as New York is kind of this wild, wild west of legalization, where they haven't quite made fundamental laws about what you can or cannot do. We're seeing cannabis speakeasies pop up all over the city. Some of them are really luxe. Some of them are blowing my mind with how luxury they are.
Wow.
And so I think we're only going to see a convergence of, multiple different vices as the industry becomes more mature, and that the hospitality space is where I'm honestly most excited for, because who doesn't want to do things while, smoking weed, right? Like everyone wants to, like, whatever you want to do, watch a movie, you want to smoke weed, eat dinner, you want to smoke weed in between that, have sex, you want to smoke weed. Why not blend all the two? So we're seeing a lot more of that come out. And I think it's going to be a area in the industry to watch for sure. As for me personally, I just got the final proofs of it. I can send you the images. I don't know if you want to pop them over. I am not even going to try to find them right now, because they're very buried in my computer and my internet's not great. But I am launching a more accessible version of my service. MAV PR is a full service boutique PR agency where we specialize in print, digital, and select broadcast media relations. In order to do that, that's a lot of hours to be able to keep brands relevant. And so for brands that are just starting out and have maybe a lot of their budget was eaten up by unexpected hurdles, something got stuck in customs, something got returned, something just got lost or wrong sizing, they have to redo everything. A lot of times, a lot of the brands I speak with, they are so incredible and have so much heart. And these are the brands I want to not only launch, but grow with. Most of my clients, they stay on for years. I can't get rid of them, and they can't get rid of me if we tried.
That's a good problem to have.
I love it. I love watching my babes grow, and when they bring on these great teammates, and it's just like this huge ancestral community, around my clients. I absolutely love it. I love growing with them, and I want to start with, not just the ones who can pay the full retainer, but those who are looking for a bit of a deal. And I really racked my brain of how to do this to be able to keep giving you guys, my journalists, podcasters, producers, editors, everyone, more sources. You guys are always looking for new guests to interview, new products to feature, whatever the case is. And obviously publicists are only going to recommend their clients outside of their real like fan favorites.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not as good of a source to you guys if I don't constantly have new clients. So I was trying to figure out a way to break that mold of, can I bring on clients at a more accessible price? And rather than doing single product campaigns, the idea is to kind of be the first direct to press subscription box where you guys are going to get a box, whether you're in cannabis, so you get the drug box, and folks who are or the vice box, you have your pick. Folks who are interested in sex and cannabis can go for the vice box, and folks in sex can get the love box, where it's called press box, and it's going to have a seasonal selection of products that fit those categories. So the folks in vice are going to get anything from mushroom tea and vape pens and condoms and lubricant and maybe a sex toy. Folks in, and these are going to be brands that you haven't heard from or haven't seen in a while. And it's honestly, we put them together and I'm like, okay, I can't wait till this launch is over because I want all the products in this box.
You're like, yeah, that's actually a really good idea though. I mean, it's a great way to spread what's out there and really allow somebody to try the products firsthand to get a sense of whether it works for them or not. I like that
Honestly,
concept.
PR cannot be done without getting the product in their hands. It's so difficult because you guys have a reputation. You can't just recommend to anyone, right?
Right.
You can't just say, oh, I like this brand, but I've never tried it. Because what happens if your consumers go out of their way, spend a lot of money on it, and or even go all the way to California, bring it all the way back, and they're like, well, this is shit. Why did you recommend this? It goes on your credibility.
Sure.
So it absolutely, they have to show that proof of concept. We can't just tell, we have to show as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, the products in the hands really, and also when journalists are using products every day, they remember to mention them in articles that they work on later when they get to work.
Right, exactly. Yes, the word of mouth, right? And I going back to your market trends and predictions, I think you're spot on in terms of the convergence, right? And how you're just going to see more and more of the two vices kind of blend, and it's great to hear that those consumption lounges are popping up in New York, and how they're, like you said, there's a lot of speakeasies as well. That's really cool that they're doing that.
I literally hear of a new event every week, and I'm like, oh, wow, that sounds really luxury. I'm like, oh, we've done stuff like that. And then I look at the pictures. I'm like, no, we have not. This is new. People are really coming in hard. New York is, we don't always ask permission for things. We don't wait for permission. We just go ahead and do it. And when they tell us it's illegal, that's when we stop eventually. And, and it's also such a creative and such a hustling city where people see the opportunity and they pounce on it. And people know that, New Yorkers know that even before we were legal, everyone always told me that New York is the biggest cannabis market in the world. Anywhere I go, Barcelona, Amsterdam, California, they say New York City, biggest cannabis market in the world.
Wow.
Everyone smokes weed. Even if you go back to like Law and Order early episodes, like late 90s, you're seeing, even the way they talk about it, they're like, I was just smoking a joint, like not a big deal. We all fucking do it, And so it's like that has always been a fiber of like the New York personality. It's like, of all the drugs you're gonna do, cannabis is like literally the least worst of all of them. So
I've heard that. I have heard that, and it's been echoed on this podcast. I think that Laura and Allison actually were saying, and others also, that like, yeah, California's big, but the real consumer market is in New York City. It's the biggest. And kind of what someone predicted, I forget who it was, but they said like California is going to be the grow destination, right? It's going to be the place where they know how to cultivate, but where people are buying the most is going to be New York City. So that's kind of a prediction of how, Godzilla and King Kong are going to play out in the coming years. So
yeah, I think it's going to be pretty uncomparable because the way New Yorkers are, not only are we going to do it, but we're going to do it well. Like New York has some of the best food destinations and the best hospitality destinations. There's no way we're not going to absolutely slay the cannabis game.
Yep. It's gonna be fun to see. Melissa and Vitale, what do you want to close with? You want to leave the audience with anything before we wrap up?
Oh, what do I want to leave the audience with? Any brands looking for PR, hit me up. You are going to be providing my Instagram, I believe.
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to be putting it in the description box.
Perfect. And on my Twitter is where my main line. I'm going to be on vacation for the next 10 days. So no pressure to reach out to me right away. But I love talking to new brands. People want to send me samples. I love sampling and sharing my favorites with my press because I have to be unbiased. I can't just recommend my clients. So send me samples, ask me your questions. And also, if you are curious about the wild, wild world of cannabis and sex PR, my website has tons and tons of blog posts, which are just my word vomit on the industry going back since I started the agency. So definitely some great resources in there, and some not so great ones that you'll learn to sort through it. Kevin, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to your audience if they're still listening. And any other thing from me that I can answer for you?
No, this was very insightful conversation. I appreciate you sharing your experience and what you do at MAV PR. Sorry that I read that out. I didn't realize it was the letters only. So MAV PR.
Oh, I mean, honestly, I'm just always happy to be included. So if people like butcher it a little bit, Men's Health just did MVPR, and I was like, good enough.
As long as my name's in there, they'll make sense of it. Yeah.
When you Google Melissa Vitale anywhere in the world, my website's the first thing that shows up. So I'm not worried about it.
Nice. Hey, it's always nice to be number one on Google. That's cool.
Not
Awesome.
complaining.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much again. Really appreciate it. Let's do it again. As things evolve and cannabis becomes legal in more and more states, and hopefully very soon federally. It's going to change the game in a lot of ways. So I'd love to have you back so we can talk about it.
Always. And keep me posted if you ever need some cool sources in the industry, especially some smooth talking New Yorkers like myself. Got tons of them.
I would love it. Yeah, we'll connect offline and enjoy your the rest of your vacation. I'm jealous.
Well, have a great weekend, Kevin. We'll chat soon.
Yes, and thank you all for listening. Bye.
Bye, guys.